Okay, here we go. Okay, I believe we are recording now. So let's go ahead and keep talking about the adventures of college kid Darwin. We left him kind of floundering at the University of Edinburgh Medical School, deciding that he didn't really want to become a doctor. As I've been known to tell pre-meds now, being a doctor sounds really glamorous, but basically you spend a third of your time sticking your fingers up people's butts and the other 2/3 filling out paperwork. And as I've mentioned, surgery was a horror because anesthetics had not quite been discovered, although they would, I think 1833 is when they would come in. So he's only a few years before that. The other thing that had not been discovered was basic cleanliness. So this is when, medicine is very messy and filthy, and that was just not for him. It's just not working out. I mentioned that Robert Grant, who was a local doctor who had gone over to invertebrate zoology, mentored Darwin. Darwin did some little research papers under Grant's direction. Grant turned him on to Lamarck's ideas, although Darwin was not really impressed. There's one more person who's important in the story, and he might seem like a bit player now, but we'll have reason to come back to him. And that's a man named John Edmonstone. Edmonstone had actually been a slave, and slave to a Scottish landowner who had a plantation on the Demerara River in Suriname. Suriname is in the northern part of South America, just east of Venezuela. And his owner had brought him to Scotland in 1817, and Edmonstone had immediately been freed. This will actually have more relevance than just trivia. Great Britain at the time was still allowing slavery in its colonies. There was slavery in Suriname and in Jamaica. That's another big one. And of course, there'd been slavery in the North American colonies, although by this time the United States were independent. We all know that story. But Great Britain did not allow slavery within its own home territory. People used to say that English air makes a man free. So as soon as John's owner brought him to Scotland, John was automatically legally freed. And he set up shop as a taxidermist, of all things. And he made his living stuffing birds and teaching taxidermy. And one of the things I haven't mentioned is that even though Darwin couldn't stand human blood, he was a really keen hunter, mostly birds. He was out there on the first day of the season every day, shooting, pheasants and grouse and things like that. He was very keen on that sport. And Darwin wanted to learn how to, stuff and mount some of his trophy birds. I'm sure you know what that's like. This is Arkansas, so probably half of you have the head of a 10-point buck on the wall, or someone who does. And so Darwin wanted to learn how to do this, and he paid Edmonstone to teach lessons in taxidermy. And first of all, this would turn out to be a useful skill, but second, Edmonstone was apparently, as Darwin remembered in his autobiography many years later, Edmonstone was a very pleasant and intelligent man. We don't know very much about his life. We don't even know when he died. We don't even have a picture of him. This is a later artist's impression. But we know that they would spend hours just talking. And John Edmonstone told Darwin all about the South American jungle, the rainforest that's down there. Edmonstone had apparently become quite knowledgeable about the animal life of the South American rainforest. And Darwin was really inspired. He thought it would be really cool to visit South America someday. And as we'll see, he did get his chance, and it wouldn't be too long. And I'll have occasion to come back to Edmonstone. There's a little bit more about him I have to say than that. But for now, let's say that Darwin dropped out of medical school after 2 years. By all accounts, his dad was normally a very kind man, but his dad kind of lost his temper. And Darwin remembered his father telling him, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." I'm sure that if some of you dropped out of college, your parents might have similar sentiments to express. Well, what's that leave? Dr. Robert Darwin doesn't want his kids to grow up idle. They were well enough off that Darwin could probably have just been the 19th century equivalent of a trust fund kid, you know, somebody who just lives off the family fortune and parties a lot. But no, he didn't want to do that. Medicine is
Excuse me, Bailey got kicked out of here and she needs to be let back in.
Okay, hang on. Let me see how I can do that. Okay, I've temporarily got to pause the share. Okay, I'm letting someone in. Okay, I'm not seeing her. Okay, hang on, I'm not seeing her coming back.
I'm here. It was, my name is wrong every time I log in. I just changed it.
Okay, all right.
Thank you so much. I don't know what happened.
Okay, sorry about that. I see you now.
It's okay.
All right, let's go back to that screen share. Okay, so here we are. So Darwin can't be a doctor. He doesn't want to go in the army, which was kind of another path towards respectability. And he's not particularly interested in law. So what that leaves is religion. His dad sent him to Cambridge University. Cambridge University consists of a lot of residential colleges, you know, kind of like the ones we have here. So Darwin's dad packed him off to Christ College of Cambridge University in 1828 to study for priesthood in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. In case you don't know, the branch of the Church of England in the United States is known as the Episcopal Church. You've probably heard of them under that name. So they've actually restored Darwin's old dorm room to the way it would have looked in 1828. And yes, he's got a gun up there. Times have changed a bit, but that is, of course, that's his hunting gun. Remember, he's very keen on going out and shooting birds when he gets the chance. Minor trivia, but I've always liked this as kind of funny. You know, college kids today get up to wacky hijinks. One of the fun things that he did as a student was form a club with some of his fellows. Was called the Glutton Club. And what they did was they wanted to eat every bird in the British Isles. So they would go out and shoot all kinds of birds that you wouldn't normally think of using for food. They wanted to try everything. Apparently the club broke up after the night that they tried to eat an owl. So word of advice, if you ever go to a restaurant and owl is on the menu, you should probably get the chicken instead. Apparently the European brown owl is absolutely nasty. So yeah, don't eat owl. So that was his way of having a wild time at college. The classes weren't anything to write home about. One of the big changes between now and then is universities now emphasize, you know, science and modern languages. And of course, these days we've thrown in, you know, business and things like that. At this time, university curricula consisted mostly of math, Latin and Greek, and theology. And as Darwin later said, as far as the academical studies were concerned, my time was wasted. The work was repugnant to me. He did get okay grades. He ended up graduating. Actually, he couldn't remember, but it was in the top half of his class. I think it was somewhere between 5th and 12th. So he got pretty solid grades. He was able to suck it up and complete assignments like writing Latin poetry, which you would not think of as an important job skill, but that's not really the point of a college education at the time. But one thing that I think is still true is that at least as important as what classes you take are what you get to do outside the classroom and what sort of connections you can make. And Darwin did have plenty of time to indulge his hobbies. Hunting we've talked about, but he was also really keen on collecting beetles. So a classmate of his actually drew a couple of cartoons of him riding out on a giant beetle. The one on the right, down below, you can just see he's written, "Go it, Charlie." Go it being an old way of saying, go for it. Go for it, as he rides off to hunt beetles. And he was so keen on collecting, he actually sent specimens and notes to leading entomologists at the time. And down there you can see just a few records that were published in a book called Illustrations of British Entomology. So you can see he's collected notes on the abundance of beetles in the genus Colymbetes, which is actually shown up there at the top right. And as he later said, no poet ever felt more delight at seeing his first poem published than I did at seeing in Stevens' Illustrations of British Insects the magic words captured by C. Darwin, Esquire. So there. Big on beetles, big on hunting, big on eating weird birds, doesn't really care about Latin and Greek, but very interested in natural science. He took science classes with Professor John Stevens Henslow, this is he, learned from him, also became friends with the guy, went to dinner at his house several times, and Henslow used to have as dinner guests some of the top scientists in England at the time. So Darwin got to meet some fairly famous people. They went on nature hikes together, and he became a really close friend of the family. Henslow recommended that Darwin ought to learn some geology. So Darwin studied some geology with a professor named Adam Sedgwick, who was one of the top geologists at the time. That's not actually Sedgwick or Darwin, that's just kind of a random picture of a geologist from those days. But there's a geologist collecting rock samples while some little kid looks at him and asks him what he's doing, I guess. And remember, Darwin is studying for the ministry. Darwin's going to be a minister in the Church of England. So why is he even bothering to take science classes? Well, required for the theology degree were the works of a man by the name of Reverend William Paley. So there's Paley right there. He had passed by the time Darwin was at school, but those works were required. And one of Darwin's favorite books was Paley's book called Natural Theology. And the title of that book is a thing. There's an entire school of philosophy called Natural Theology. And it was one of his favorite books at the time, as he later would say, at the time he almost had it memorized. And Paley's book will give you a clue. Hello, cat. as to why it is that candidates for, the priesthood were taking classes in botany and zoology and geology. Paley's book tried to argue the existence of God, even if you did not believe everything in the Bible. Paley said you had to believe that there was a creator simply by looking at the natural world, a creator who had not only created everything, but designed it. As he put it, the marks of design are too strong to be got over. Design must have had a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person is God. So it was an attempt to make a very rigorous logical case for the existence of not just a designer, but a designer who was the same as the God of traditional Christian belief. And Paley starts his book with a metaphor that you've probably heard before. He says, if I'm walking out in the field and I trip over a rock, and I ask, how did that rock get there? There's no particularly interesting answer to the question. Rocks are just there. Rocks are just a feature of living on Earth, and maybe that rock has been there for, umpteen up millions of years, however it comes. There isn't any real story to be told. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. Well, they said you'd notice something. First of all, the watch is made up of lots of different parts, unlike rocks, which are not really made of parts as such. I mean, they might be made up of grains or crystals or something, but they're not as complex in their structure as watches are. Watches are made of lots of parts. The parts are put together in a particular arrangement. Did I just get kicked out? Folks, can you see me?
No, you're still there.
Okay. All right. I think the cat might have hit a key. I don't know if you can see this, but the cat has decided it's time for pettins. Nice kitty. Okay. The watch is made of parts. The parts are put together in a very precise arrangement. The arrangement enables the watch to do something, namely keep time. And if you rearrange the parts, if you change the arrangement of the parts in any way, the watch doesn't keep time, right? It'll stop working, or, maybe it'll run fast or slow or something like that. And this is very different from the kind of existence that a rock has. Rocks aren't there to do anything. Rocks are just rocks. Rocks just sit there and rock out. There we go. Okay. Watches do something, and they're complex in a way that rocks can't be. And Paley argued that the inference is inevitable that the watch must have had a maker who comprehended its construction and designed its use. So that's the metaphor. God is a watchmaker. Nature and life and every living thing is a watch, although put together in a much more complicated and amazing way than any human watch could be. Watches, you can't put two watches together in a box and open the box later and find that they've given birth to a litter or anything like that. Watches don't reproduce themselves. Animals and plants do, and that's even more amazing. And most of the book is this long list of incredible ways that animals and plants are adapted to the environment that they're in. That they show very, very finely tuned adaptations to conditions that they find themselves in. A lot of the book is just a long, rapturous list of incredible things that organisms do. And all of this ultimately is supposed to point the way to the maker of all of those incredibly complex things, namely God. So even if you're not sure about all this Bible stuff, studies of nature ought to bring you to a knowledge of God who is identical with the God of the Bible, all powerful and all loving, and all of the things you learned in Sunday school. This wasn't Paley's original idea. It went back, it goes back to Jesus saying, "Consider the lilies of the field." One of the first British scientists, a guy named Francis Bacon, had advocated that people should be learned in both the book of God's word and the book of God's works. Something like, "Let man aspire to an endless proficiency in both," is what Bacon said. But Paley had summed it up probably better than anybody had, and written in a very engaging style. That's why Darwin loved the book and almost could have recited it from memory, as he later said. And that's why Paley was required reading, and that's why these people who were going to be Anglican priests were taking courses in biology and geology. It would be important for them to know something about how God reveals himself in nature, not just in the Bible. That's why people like Henslow had been hired in the first place. So if the existence of a watch demands the existence of a watchmaker, how much more must the existence of living things demonstrate that there must be a creator? You'll encounter this argument in various guises to this day. I have heard it explained to me by some very, very devout people. If you've grown up in Arkansas, you've probably been exposed to ideas like this before. I don't particularly care to argue religious concepts in a science class, and what you ultimately believe about all this is entirely up to you. I'm not going to ask, it's none of my business. One of the counter arguments would be that the natural world has amazing adaptations, but it's also a world full of pain and suffering. Why did the creator make cats like this one right here? Hello, cat. Why did the creator make cats who not only kill mice, but play with them and put them through torture before they actually kill them? And then don't even eat them, but leave them, torn up and half digested on the front door, right, cat? Yes. Tiger, tiger, burning bright through the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame their fearful symmetry? Why do we live in a world where there are wasps that will lay their eggs inside live caterpillars, and the caterpillars get devoured from the inside out slowly over the course of weeks by these insect larvae inside them? I don't know how many of you folks grew up singing hymns, but there's an old hymn from about this time by a woman named Fanny Crosby. It's sung to a couple of different tunes, but the one I grew up with was, "All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Each little flower that opens, each little bird that sings, he made their glowing colors, he made their tiny wings." Anyway, I bring this up because Monty Python wrote their own version of this. They sing it to a different tune, but sung to the tune I know, it was, "All things dull and ugly, all creatures gross and squat, all things rude and nasty, the Lord God made the lot. So if you believe in a God who created all things bright and beautiful, the same God presumably also created all things dull and ugly. There's more verses in there about, all things scabbed and cancerous, all things foul and dangerous. You can work this out for yourself philosophically if you'd care to. But as my dearly departed buddy Neil Peart used to say, such a lot of pain on the earth, it's somehow so badly arranged. So natural theology tends to run into the problem of evil, and how to solve that, it would kind of take us a little bit too far afield. But whatever you think of it, it was a very influential idea at the time. And it's important because natural theology gives people a reason to study biology and look for these adaptations. And they certainly impressed Boy Darwin quite a lot. As he later said, I could almost formally have said it by heart. So this isn't, and certainly, reading this book got Darwin to focus on what we now just call adaptations, on the huge number of ways that living things are adapted to their environment. Those are quite real. What Darwin would do is come up with an alternate explanation for how they got there. But we'll look at that in good time. Hello, cat. Nice kitty. So he graduates in 1831. He probably would have gone from there right into the Church of England. He would have been given some time to pray on the matter, and then he would have been ordained and probably spent his life as a priest in a comfortable church, maybe not even having to do very much. What changed his life was that there was a British Navy captain, Captain Robert Fitzroy. This is he. Fitzroy, okay. The big picture is that Britain is building up a huge navy. They're sending it globally. I mean, they're probably the first really big blue water navy at the time. Just to tie this in with John Edmonstone's story, one of the things Britain would soon be doing is creating a very large fleet of ships called the West Africa Squadron. Once they'd barred slavery everywhere in their empire, they actually put a great deal of effort and money into building ships to stop the slave trade, trying to intercept slave ships before they could get to the New World. They were sending ships everywhere, reminding people, hi there, we're the British, we have lots of ships and we have lots of guns and ships. And one of the things that you need if you're going to have a big navy like that is accurate maps and charts. You would not want to lose a very expensive warship by crashing it into a rock that your map didn't tell you was there. So they're sending out exploring voyages all over the world. And Fitzroy was captain of a ship whose mission was to survey the South American coast. It's this ship, Her Majesty's ship Beagle. Not one of the huge warships. The biggest warships of the time could carry something like 120 cannons. The Beagle only carried 10. The Beagle is like the Ford Ranger of the Navy. They're used to carry messages, bring supplies. They're not big enough to fight in a full-scale battle, but they can chase away pirates and smugglers and things like that. And these were used for mapping voyages because they're small enough to get into small inlets and coves and things like that. There we go. Yes, the Beagle was originally built as a Cherokee-class brig, although they added a mast to her and she became a bark. Barque. That's the type of ship she was. And her assignment was to chart the coast of South America and Tierra del Fuego, the island off the southern tip of South America itself. Okay, the Beagle had actually gone out on a previous surveying voyage under a different captain, a captain with the name of Captain Pringle Stokes. The problem is that when you're on a sailing ship, first of all, they're small. You have a lot of young men who are packed together like sardines in a ship like that, sleeping next to each other on the deck, smelling each other's farts and feet, and never getting away from each other, working very difficult and demanding work sometimes not getting much sleep. In a situation like that, tensions can flare, fights can break out. And the captain's job is to keep a lid on all of that by imposing iron discipline, right? You cannot screw around on a ship like this, especially when everybody has to work together. Hoisting and lowering those sails is a job that everybody has to do, and everybody has to do it in a very coordinated way if that ship is going to get anywhere. The captain has to make sure that all of this happens, that everything is shipshape. That's not a pun. That's where the term even, comes from. And the result is the captain can't have any friends. The captain, there's always a distance between officers and enlisted people in any military, but it's especially critical when you're crammed together on a tiny ship doing, in dangerous situations, weeks away from home, with no way to get off the ship, no place to blow off steam, and, no way to get packages and letters from home for weeks on end. Under those circumstances, the captain cannot be too friendly with anybody, because if it looks like the captain is being buddies with one person and being hard on everybody else, that's a pretty good way for a mutiny to break out, for the sailors to rebel and refuse to sail the ship. So the captain of a ship at the time, a captain of a ship at sea was basically God, had the power to imprison or, flog or execute anybody that he had to. He had the power of life and death. He couldn't be friendly, and that meant that a ship captain was under incredible psychological stress. And Pringle Stokes, the original captain of the Beagle, had committed suicide. And they brought in Fitzroy to finish, and Fitzroy had brought the Beagle back, and now he was going to make a second trip to do the job right. Fitzroy had been trained with, a good scientific education, instead of the old way of training ship captains, which was start as a boy and try not to get killed. And he wanted to not just make charts, but study the natural history, the animals and plants and rocks of South America, because some of that would have commercial or military use, right? If that mast falls down, you might want to know where's the closest place you can get timber to make a new one, for example. Or are there any interesting metal ores that, might be a good commercial venture? Things like that could be important. Fitzroy also knew how isolating and incredibly stressful it was to be in command of a sailing ship like this, and he wanted to get somebody who would not be part of the chain of command, who could come along with him, have dinner with him, talk to him as an equal, be kind of an escape valve outside of the rigorous, command structure of ships at the time. So he was looking for somebody who could be his sounding board and, his, psychological release. Somebody he could talk to not as a subordinate, but as a social equal. So Fitzroy was asking around, trying to find somebody who would fit the bill. And he asked Henslow, and Henslow said, "I'd love to go." And his wife said, "You can certainly go." And Henslow said, "I'd better not go." Sometimes when your wife gives you permission, you really must not take it. Sometimes that happens. But Henslow said, "Hey, wait a minute. I had this student. He's just graduated. He knows animals, plants, and rocks as well as anybody does. He's really smart. And possibly more importantly, he is incredibly nice. Every account I've ever read of Darwin's life shows that he was really easygoing, nice, kind, easy to talk to, easy to get along with, just the kind of person you'd want to have at your Thanksgiving dinner to diffuse the tensions between you and your drunkle. I'm sure some of you have had experiences like that. So Fitzroy said, "I want to meet this guy." And he's determined to go back and finish the surveying job. And they set up a meeting, and the two men hit it off pretty well. And Darwin went to his dad and said, "Hey, I've got this great opportunity to travel around the world, and I'll get to see South America, like John Edmonston told me was so awesome. And it's a terrific opportunity. And all you have to do is pay all of my expenses for a 3-year cruise around the world." And Dad said, "What?" Then, as now, things like this didn't go over all that well. You know, Darwin's dad was afraid he would waste all of his money. And Darwin said, "Hey, come on, look, we're going to be at sea for weeks. I'd have to be really clever to figure out a way to waste your money in the middle of the ocean." And Dad said, "They tell me you're pretty clever. You know, if there's a way you can waste my money in the middle of the ocean, you'll figure it out." But in the end, Dad was kind of a soft touch and agreed to pay his son's bills. And Darwin was finally allowed to go. There's the Beagle in the Thames River at London. And he got on board, and they left England 2 days after Christmas, 1831. I should mention, by the way, Darwin turned out not to make a very good sailor. He tended to get terribly seasick and spent a lot of time in the hammock in his little cabin. Very crowded on that ship, but at least he had a cabin of his own. Wasn't room for a bed, so he slept in a hammock, and they stored the ship's maps underneath the hammock in a big chest. So very crowded. He was very good at being a companion to Captain Fitzroy. Fitzroy was noted for having a real temper on him. And the other officers of the ship used to go see Darwin after breakfast. He'd have breakfast with Captain Fitzroy, and they'd see him after breakfast and ask if they'd had any hot coffee. That was the code word for the captain's temper. If there had been a lot of hot coffee, that meant that Captain Fitzroy was really pissed about something and somebody was really going to get an earful. The officers and even the sailors generally liked him. Like I said, he was an easy guy to get along with. And his choice of reading material changed the course of history, because he brought a book with him called Principles of Geology, Volume 1, by a former lawyer by the name of Charles Lyell. He's an important guy. And there he is. Lyell's still called the father of modern geology because he proposed a way of thinking about Earth history using evidence from the rocks. He proposed an approach to reading the past called uniformitarianism. Okay, what the heck is that? Well, the idea went back a couple of 100 years before him that the Earth had some kind of past, and there were clues to that past that you could find in the rocks. No less a person than Leonardo da Vinci, when he wasn't painting the Mona Lisa, had picked up fossil shells around his home in Italy and concluded that there must have once been an ocean there that wasn't there anymore. So clearly the Earth had undergone some kind of change. And you can certainly do this today, and not really great around here, but in many parts of Arkansas, you can find fossil seashells and things like that. So clearly we used to have ocean here at some point. Can you be a little more specific than that? There was a common theory at the time called catastrophism. That's the idea that the Earth's history has been dominated by these powerful catastrophic events that wipe out most or all of the life on Earth. Between catastrophes, nothing very much happens. The dinosaurs, go roaming around for millions of years. And then some colossal catastrophe happens and wipes them all out and just wipes the slate clean. And then new forms of life show up. Where they come from, we'll kind of leave that aside for now. And new forms of life come and they do their thing and nothing very much happens until the next cosmic catastrophe wipes the slate clean. People who were devoutly religious liked this idea because you could always say that the biblical flood, the one described in the book of Genesis, was the last catastrophe in a long series. Lyell, however, begged to differ. He was not a great fan of catastrophism. Now, for the record, we do know that there have been global catastrophes like this. If you know your dinosaurs, you may know that the extinction of the dinosaurs, and actually a lot of other living things as well, happened about 65 million years ago, and it's connected with a meteorite hitting the Earth on what's now the Yucatan Peninsula, by the way. So there can be catastrophes like this, but Lyell argued that it was much more fruitful to think in a different way. Uniformitarianism is sometimes summed up with the catchphrase, "the present is the key to the past." What do we mean by that? Well, first of all, if you want to look at ancient rocks and work out what they mean for the history of the Earth, you start with uniformity of law, the idea that the basic laws of science don't change over time. Gravity has always attracted things together with an acceleration that is proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Carbon has always had 6 protons in the nucleus. Nothing has ever been faster than light. The basic fundamental laws of physics have not changed over time. There's various ways we have of testing this now. Uniformity of process is the idea that the natural processes going on Earth have always operated. We've always had volcanoes. We've got volcanic rock forming now in Hawaii. We have the same kind of rock preserved in the Ozarks up around a little town called Ironton, Missouri. Those look like the volcanic rocks that form now, that we can see forming now if we go to Hawaii. So those rocks must have formed by the same process in the past. The Earth has always had volcanoes. It's always had erosion. It's always had rivers carrying silt to the ocean and building up layers of it. It's always had freezing and thawing and things like that. All of these processes that affect the Earth's surface today have always been in effect for as long as there's been an Earth. Lyell also argued that these processes have always operated at the same rates and that the result was that Earth hasn't changed overall, that mountains have always been pushed up by geologic forces under the crust, and mountains have always eroded, but the balance has always been the same. There've always been mountains, there've always been prairies, there've always been oceans white with foam, and the Earth hasn't really changed its state overall. We don't really accept uniformity of rate and state today, certainly not rate for most geological processes. Erosion doesn't always happen at exactly the same speed. But law and process work very well, and this makes geology almost like forensic science, right? When you see somebody on CSI or whatever it is, you know, doing an autopsy and working out, you know, where did the bullet hit and where was it fired from, they're using uniformity of law, the idea that the laws of science haven't changed over time. So any bullet fired out of a 9mm pistol is going to follow the same basic trajectory as a consequence of the laws of gravity and the chemistry of gunpowder exploding. And natural processes like, you know, bodies decaying and things like that have always operated. You couldn't do a crime scene investigation without those. Or, you know, accident investigation. If you're studying the length of skid marks on a road to figure out when the driver started braking and how fast he was going when he hit the tree, you have to assume the laws of science were in effect, and that natural processes like friction and slamming on the brakes and screaming and all of that operated when the accident happened in the same way that they operate today. So you have to take these two to be able to talk in any intelligible way about reconstructing a past event that you didn't see, whether it's an ancient volcano or a car accident on a country road last week. And this means you don't have to assume that unprecedented catastrophes, unlike anything we know, have altered the face of the Earth. What you need is processes that happen today and lots of time. This is an illustration from Lyell's book, Principles of Geology. It's the remains of a Roman temple, the Temple of Serapis. Serapis was an Egyptian god that the Romans borrowed because they never threw gods away. Built at Pozzuoli on the island of Sicily. If you've ever seen a map of Europe, you know that Italy looks like a boot. Sicily looks like a deflated soccer ball that the boot's about to kick. Lyell had enough money from his law practice that he actually got to visit. He took a grand tour for several years of geological sites in Europe. Incidentally, he also took a grand tour of geological sites in North America, got all the way to the Mississippi River. I can't remember if he made it into Arkansas, but he traveled quite a lot to see important geological sites. And that's one of them. We know the temple was built on land. We have inscriptions in the temples which show that it was in use at least up until the year 200, because the inscriptions mention various Roman emperors, and we know when they ruled. So we know people were using it up until about the year 200. It's now so close to the edge of the sea that the floor floods at high tide. And the third thing is that you can kind of see them about a third of the way up. Those columns don't look so smooth. And that is because they are riddled with holes, and the holes are made by clams. There is, believe it or not, a type of clam that can burrow into solid rock. It's called a date mussel. I mean, you might think all clams are boring, but this one really is boring because it bores into solid rock. There we go. Sorry, cat. Sorry, kitty. Okay, so what this means is clams don't walk around on land, right? You've never had to stop your car to let a herd of clams cross the road. Clams can only live underwater, so we know that the parts of the columns that have the clam burrows in them must have been underwater at some point. We know the temple was built on land because why would you build a temple underwater? We now know that the temple is low enough that it floods. You can see the reflections of the columns there. And so you have to conclude that either the sea level has changed or the land level has changed. Lyell was able to show that it wasn't the sea level because there are other places nearby where the Romans had things like harbors and port structures, and they were still working. They were still at the same level they had been. So it's not sea level change. What it is land level change, that the land must have sunk and then been raised a little bit, maybe by just a few tens of feet. And we know that it happened in less than 2,000 years. And there were actually records of earthquakes that had caused the land to rise or sink just a couple of feet. They're earthquakes, but they're not global catastrophes. They only affected a small area. They're ordinary earthquakes. So if a few earthquakes over 2,000 years can make the land rise or sink a few tens of feet, multiply that by millions of years, and you could end up with seashells on mountaintops. And we'll come back to this idea later, but it's a powerful way of looking at geology and getting information from looking at rocks about what the past has been like. So Darwin reading Lyell as the Beagle reaches South America in 1832. This map doesn't really show it very well because what they did for the next 3 years was sail up and down the Atlantic coast of South America, up and down, up and down. Fitzroy's in charge of making these charts. Be it said that the charts he made were so good that the British Navy continued to use them until charts like this were kind of made irrelevant by the invention of satellite technology. Once you can photograph the land from space, there's not quite the same need for making maps on the ground. But the maps that Fitzroy made on the Beagle voyage were in use for over 100 years afterwards. They were that good. And Darwin didn't have to stay on the ship. Remember, he's not part of the chain of command. Fitzroy can't give him orders. He's not in the military. And his dad is footing the bills. So Darwin had the money and the time to explore inland, to go on trips and separate from the ship for days or weeks and explore South America. Darwin also was able to ship specimens back to England. Remember, he'd learned how to stuff birds, so he could shoot and preserve birds and mammals and things like that. He collected a lot of fossils and shipped them back. He sent letters back to England, wrote about his discoveries. By the time he finally got back, he had a very good reputation among scientists at the time. He was clearly, somebody to keep your eye on. He was going to go places. He would later publish a journal of his travels. It's basically an edited version of his diary. It's now published under the title Voyage of the Beagle, and it's still a pretty good read if you're interested in, tales of exploration. He finally got to see the South American rainforest. As he put, delight itself is a weak term. to express the feelings of a naturalist who, for the first time, has wandered by himself in a Brazilian forest. He finally got to see that stuff that John Edmondson had told him about. South of Brazil, Argentina has a lot of grasslands called pampas. And their history kind of mirrors the history of the United States, in that there were terrible wars between the European colonists and the indigenous people of Argentina. The grasslands were also used for cattle ranching, and there's an entire culture of people called gauchos, who are Argentinian cattle herders, cowboys. And just like the cowboy is for the United States, the gaucho is kind of a national symbol of, freedom and, riding horses and working hard and playing hard and all of that. He's kind of a national icon. And as Darwin said, the gaucho is most obliging, polite, and hospitable, but at the same time, a bold, spirited fellow. There he is. Instead of lassos, what he's using is a pair of wooden balls on a rope that he will use to entangle the legs of those ostriches. Those aren't ostriches. That's a South American flightless bird. They're called rheas, R-H-E-A. Darwin was actually exploring with some gauchos as his guide, and they caught a rhea, and they were cooking it that night, and Darwin realized it was a new species, but not until they'd eaten most of it. Darwin actually boxed up and shipped back what was left of the rhea back to England for other scientists to study. So we've got a theme there that he's shooting and eating strange birds was still kind of a hobby. So when he wasn't riding with the gauchos or oohing and aahing over the scenery, one of the things he did was collect South American fossils, including this beast. This is called a glyptodon. And glyptodons are mammals. They are, in fact, enormous armadillos. I don't have a slide of it, but I was just reading that they've discovered some fossil glyptodons in South America that are roughly the size of subcompact cars. These dudes got huge. That one's not quite as big. That's more like the size of a riding mower. But glyptodons still got enormous. But even though they're enormous, they're very clearly similar to a South American group of mammals known as armadillos. Now, the 9-banded armadillo. This is the one that you find around here, frequently run over, unfortunately. The 9-banded didn't cross the Rio Grande until about 1850. So, for the first 15 years of its existence, the Texans had nothing to eat for Thanksgiving dinner. There weren't even any armadillos in Arkansas until about 1920. I believe they've reached Nebraska by now, but they've been spreading northward in very recent time. So what we have is Dasypus novum cinctus, the 9-banded armadillo, but there's 11 species that are native to South America, including the 6-banded armadillo, the 3-banded armadillo, and the pink fairy armadillo. And I'm not kidding. That's a pink fairy armadillo. It is a real thing. It is adorable. It is pink. It is critically endangered, I might add. All right, I'll let the clock quit chiming. So why does this matter? Who cares about the animals that we know as possum on the half shell? Well, our boy kept noticing that unique fossil vertebrates of South America turned out to be very similar to living vertebrates that were also unique to South America. There are extinct armadillos in South America, and there's living armadillos in South America. There are extinct animals like this Mylodon right here that turns out to be hauntingly similar to living tree sloths, which are also South American mammals. Different lifestyle. The ground sloths are much too big to hang from trees, but very similar skeleton, just different sizes and somewhat different proportions. So there's a tree sloth on the left and that ground sloth on the right. And as Darwin wrote, this wonderful relationship in the same continent between the dead and the living will throw more light on the appearance of organic beings on our Earth and their disappearance from it than any other class of facts. What does this mean that we've got extinct armadillos and sloths in South America, the same place where we find living armadillos and sloths? It's almost if there's some kind of connection between living and extinct animals. Wonder why that is. And then some of the fossils he was finding didn't look like living animals at all, but they seemed to combine features of what we'd now call separate classes. That's a skull. I think that is a skull that Darwin actually dug up and shipped home. It's called Toxodon platensis. It belongs to a group that are now called notoungulates, which is extinct. We don't have notoungulates around anymore. But Darwin noted that the structure of its teeth proves that it was related to the rodents. In many details, it was allied to the pachyderms, that's the elephants. Judging from the position of its eyes, ears, and nostrils, it was probably aquatic like the dugong and manatee. How wonderfully are the different orders at the present time so well separated, blended together in different points of the structure of the toxodon. We classify living things and we create these boundaries between classes and subclasses and orders and all of that. You know, every living thing seems to have its pigeonhole you can put it in, its shelf and all of that. But if you look into the past, you start finding evidence that those boundaries that we create might be arbitrary, that there are living things and always have been that don't fit into any one of our pigeonholes. Wonder why that is. Hold that thought. I'll pick up on Tuesday with the story of what happened next. And this might seem like I'm reciting a lot of trivia, but I promise you, it's all ties together. It's all connected. It all goes into the way Darwin's thought would develop. So we need to look at what happens when Darwin encounters the Fuegians. So I will go ahead and stop the share and